There's a question almost nobody asks out loud, but nearly everyone carries in silence. It's not why isn't my life changing? That's the polished, acceptable version. The real version, the one that shows up at 2 in the morning when the noise dies down and it's just you and your thoughts, sounds different. It sounds like this. Why do I keep ending up in the same place, even when I swore this time would be different? Same relationship dynamic, different person, same pattern, same financial, ceiling, different job, same cap, same argument, different context, same wound. If you've ever caught yourself looking at a situation in your life and thinking this has happened before, you are not alone. And more importantly, you are not broken, weak, or beyond help. You are experiencing something that neuroscience has a name for, that depth psychology mapped more than 100 years ago, and that quantum physics is now beginning to explain from an angle that will permanently change how you see the next time a pattern shows up in your life. The angle we're exploring today is not what you'll find in the standard content about breaking patterns. We are not going to talk about identifying your triggers as if patterns were just badly behaved habits that need a to-do list to correct themselves. What we're proposing today is more radical than that, and at the same time, far more compassionate. The central thesis of this episode is this: you don't repeat patterns because you're incapable of change. You repeat patterns because a part of you still hasn't received the information that the original threat is over. Hold that. We'll unpack every word of that sentence over the next 50 minutes. Before we go deep, something needs to be said. If you landed on this episode without watching the previous ones in this series, especially the episodes on invisible loyalty, the ego's resistance, and the mechanisms that keep reality from shifting, you're going to get a lot out of this video, but you'll miss important layers that were built episode by episode. This series was designed as a progressive journey, not a collection of standalone pieces. Each episode deepens the one before it. It's worth going back to the channel and working through the sequence from the beginning. The difference between watching one video and walking the full path is the difference between knowing about transformation and actually feeling it become possible for you. Now, let's board the quantum train. The quantum architect is here, and today the train is particularly quiet before departure, because the topic we're exploring requires a different kind of listening, not the kind that's hunting for information to stack onto what you already know, the kind that's willing to see something that was hidden in plain sight. Carl Jung spent decades observing patients who repeated painful situations without being able to explain why. Intelligent, reflective people who understood intellectually what was happening and still found themselves back at the same point. Jung didn't call them weak. He called them honest witnesses to the unconscious. Because the unconscious, he said, doesn't lie. It stages, it dramatizes. It puts on the same scene over and over until what hasn't been integrated finally is. And here's the angle that changes everything. Jung didn't see repetition as failure. He saw it as an invitation. Every repetition is the unconscious saying, "Not yet, we haven't integrated this yet." There's still something here that needs attention before we move forward. The problem isn't that you repeat. The problem is that you repeat without understanding what the pattern is trying to complete. Joe Dispenza would frame this in the language of neuroscience. The brain builds emotional circuits from experiences with high emotional charge. Those circuits don't disappear when the situation passes. They stay active, waiting for similar stimuli to fire the same response. It's as if the nervous system learned a lesson under stress and decided never to forget that lesson, even when the conditions changed completely. You're not stuck in the past because you're weak. You're stuck in the past because your nervous system is doing exactly what it was designed to do: protect you based on what it learned. The loop isn't a defect. It's a safety protocol that stayed active after the emergency passed. And this is where Alan Watts steps in with that surgical precision he had for saying uncomfortable things in a way that almost makes you smile before you realize how much it stings. Watts used to say that most people aren't living in the present. They're executing a memory. They're not responding to what's happening. they're responding to what happened. And the funny thing, he'd say, is that we do this with such consistency that we end up calling it our personality. Personality. The word comes from the Latin persona, which means mask. Maybe what we call who we are is partly a collection of responses we learned in situations that no longer exist. That's the loop nobody sees, not because it's invisible, but because it's so fused with our identity that we mistake the pattern for the person. Over the next chapters, we're going to dismantle this layer by layer. We'll look at what neuroscience says about how these circuits form and how they unravel. We'll look at real cases of people who identified the central pattern of their lives and what happened when they stopped fighting it and started listening to it. And we'll close with a practice that's simple, but with a depth you'll feel in your body before you fall asleep tonight. The train is moving. And this time, we're not just observing the loop from the outside. We're going in to see what it's been holding. Let's start with a story that doesn't seem to be about patterns until you realize it's exactly about that. Sarah is 37 years old, management consultant, sharp, articulate, successful in all the ways the world tends to recognize. But every time a romantic relationship reaches a certain depth, when the intimacy gets real, when the other person starts depending on her emotionally, Sarah pulls back. Not dramatically, surgically. She starts working more, becomes less available, creates distance with a skill she simultaneously admires and resents in herself. She framed all of this not as an emotional problem but as a behavioral inefficiency, because Sarah preferred to package her pain in systems and processes, safer that way. When asked about the first time she remembered pulling away from someone she loved in order to protect herself, she went quiet for a long moment, then said, "I was 8. My mom was hospitalized for severe depression. I learned that depending on someone you love is dangerous because they can disappear without warning. The pattern wasn't self-sabotage. It was protection, a form of protection that had learned to operate with such efficiency that it was still running 30 years later in completely different contexts, with people who had nothing to do with the original situation." This is what Carl Jung called a complex. Not in the pop psychology sense of she has a complex, in the technical sense. A complex is a cluster of memories, emotions, and behavioral patterns grouped around a central experience with high emotional charge. That complex operates semi-autonomously. It acts before consciousness can intervene. It reacts before you think. Jung used to say, "We don't have complexes, complexes have us." And here's the detail that changes everything. The complex has no time stamp. For the unconscious, time doesn't work in a linear way. The 8-year-old who learned that love and loss go hand in hand did not age inside Sarah's nervous system. She's still there, running the same safety protocol in real time, right now. Jordan Peterson adds something powerful here. For Peterson, behavioral patterns are navigation maps built from emotionally significant experiences. The problem is that old maps describe old territory, and when you use a 1995 map to navigate your life in 2025, you arrive at the places the map knows, not the places you consciously want to go. Repetition, therefore, isn't a lack of growth. It's navigation with the wrong map. Now let's talk about money, because that's the strategic connection this episode is designed to make, and it's more direct than it might seem. Michael is 42 years old, entrepreneur. 3 times he built businesses that reached a certain level, and 3 times they imploded, always for different reasons on the surface. A partner who betrayed him, a market downturn, a management mistake. But the pattern was identical: growth to a certain point, collapse, rebuild from zero. When Michael started mapping not his financial history but his emotional history, he found something that unsettled him for days. His father had failed in business when Michael was 11, and before going under, his father had reached exactly the same level Michael always hit before the collapse. Michael's financial ceiling wasn't a market ceiling. It was an emotional one. An unconscious loyalty to his father, Growing beyond that point felt, at some level he had never articulated, like a betrayal. Hélio Couto, with the quantum perspective he brings to this series, would describe this as a frequency field that remains coherent with the original pattern, until reprogramming occurs at the vibrational level where the pattern was installed. This isn't metaphor. It's the recognition that human beings operate on multiple levels simultaneously, and that working only at the level of visible behavior, without accessing the level where the pattern is anchored, is like trying to put out a fire by painting the wall a different color. Carl Rogers would add something here that needs to be said directly. The natural human response to noticing a pattern is judgment. You catch yourself repeating and think you're weak, stupid, hopeless. Rogers spent his career demonstrating that self-criticism not only doesn't help, it actually activates the defense mechanism that keeps the pattern intact. You don't integrate what you judge. You integrate what you can hold with enough honesty to actually see. So before the exercise, a pause. If you recognized yourself in any of these stories, relational, financial, or otherwise, the first thing that needs to happen is not change. It's recognition without punishment. The pattern is not your enemy. It's your nervous system doing the best it knew how to do with the information available when it learned. And now you have new information. Today's exercise. Do this before you go to sleep. This practice has no deadline. It's not a 7-day or 21-day protocol. It's something you can do tonight and tomorrow night, and any time you feel a familiar pattern activate. The more you do it, the more clarity you'll build. But there's no obligation, only an invitation. Before you sleep, grab a piece of paper or open a note on your phone. Bring to mind a recent situation that felt familiar in a way that bothered you. A conflict, a choice, a feeling. Something you recognized while it was happening, as this has happened before. Write one sentence describing the situation. Just one. Now, instead of asking, "Why did I do that again?" ask a different question. Ask, "What was that response?" Protecting? Don't analyze, don't explain. Let the first answer surface without filtering it. It might be an image, a memory, a sensation in the body. Write down whatever comes. Finally, say out loud to yourself, before you close your eyes, "I heard you. Thank you for protecting me." You can rest now. This isn't symbolic. It's a direct communication to the nervous system in the language it understands, which is the language of recognition and safety. You're not pretending everything is fine. You're informing the system that the original threat has been acknowledged, and that from here, you're taking conscious command. There's a classic neuroscience experiment that most people have never heard of, but that explains more about pattern repetition than any self-help book you've ever read. In 1968, researchers at the University of Wisconsin ran an experiment with rhesus monkeys that seemed too simple to reveal anything profound. They exposed the animals to an unexpected stimulus paired with a reward. They recorded the activity of a specific group of neurons. What they found changed neuroscience. The neurons that had been firing in response to the reward began, over time, to fire not when the reward arrived, but when the stimulus that preceded it appeared. The brain had learned to anticipate. And more than that, it had learned to generate the emotional response of the reward before the reward existed, simply because the familiar stimulus appeared. This isn't a minor finding. This is the biological mechanism of pattern repetition in its most unfiltered form. Joe Dispenza, who has spent years translating advanced neuroscience into accessible language, describes the process like this. Every time you have an experience with high emotional charge, the brain doesn't just register the event. It registers the complete package, the environment, the people, the sounds, the smells, the physical sensations, and creates a neural map that connects all of those elements. The next time any piece of that package appears, the brain anticipates the full pattern and begins generating the corresponding emotional responses before the event has even fully materialized. In practical terms, you don't need to be in the original situation for the pattern to activate. You just need a sufficiently similar cue, a tone of voice, a particular kind of silence. The way someone looks at you. Your bank account hitting a certain number, and then the body takes over. Here's something. Neuroscience has confirmed that fundamentally changes how you should think about pattern change. When the body is in a state of intense emotion, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational thinking, decision-making, and perspective, literally reduces its activity. In moments of high emotional charge, you don't think clearly not because you're weak, but because the nervous system, in automatic response mode, redirects energy away from higher cognitive functions toward immediate survival. In other words, at the exact moment you most need your consciousness to break the pattern, you have the least access to it. Peterson calls this a hijacking of the threat response system. What was programmed as a threat, whether a real physical danger from decades ago or a perceived emotional threat in the present, activates the same circuits. And those circuits don't check the date before firing. There's a research finding worth naming here with full clarity. Studies in neuroplasticity have shown that neural circuits reinforced repeatedly over years don't disappear through conscious intention. They weaken through disuse and are replaced by new circuits that are practiced with sufficient frequency. Donald Hebb's famous observation, neurons that fire together, wire together. The reverse is equally true. Neurons that stop firing together lose their connection. The good news from the science is this: the brain is plastic. The pattern is not permanent, but it requires more than intention. It requires repetition of a new pattern until the new circuit is strong enough to compete with the old one. Alan Watts would have something to say here, and with that dry wit that was his trademark. He'd say something like, "The trouble with people is they want transformation without the inconvenience of actually changing. They want the result without the process. They want the new without releasing the old. And then they're surprised when the old keeps showing up." There's something in that observation that is simultaneously embarrassing and liberating. Embarrassing because it's true. Liberating because, if the problem is that we're trying to have the new while holding on to the old, then the solution doesn't require extraordinary willpower. It requires honesty about what we're still holding, and why. Hélio Couto, within the quantum framework that runs through this entire series, would describe the formation of a pattern as the crystallization of a frequency in the individual's informational field. An experience with high emotional intensity doesn't just create a neural circuit, it creates what he'd call a coherence point between the internal state and the external field. The field learns to mirror the frequency the individual consistently emits, and we emit consistently what is most deeply programmed. This connects neuroscience and quantum physics in a way that isn't speculative. What you call external reality is, in significant part, a reflection of what your internal system is continuously broadcasting as a signal. Change the signal, change the mirror. But to change the signal, you first need to recognize what signal you're sending. And that requires exactly the kind of self-observation that most people avoid because it's uncomfortable. In the next chapter, we're going to look at what happens when someone stops avoiding that discomfort and decides to look directly at the central pattern of their life. The cases we'll explore share something in common that might surprise you. In every single one of them, the turning point was not when the person got stronger, it was when they got more honest. And if you want to keep going deeper on this journey, the channel has episodes that build these layers one at a time, with the kind of precision that you'll only feel when you walk the sequence in order. The difference between catching one episode and moving through the full series is real, and it's worth your time. Let's look at 3 turning points. Not success stories in the way social media would package them. Stories of clarity. Because clarity always comes before transformation. Always. The first case is a man we'll call David, 51 years old, 3 marriages. Each ending differently on the surface. One a betrayal, one a slow incompatibility, one a quiet fade. But in each one, David described the same experience. At a certain point, I stopped being present. I can't explain it. I was there, but I wasn't. There, David wasn't absent by character. He was absent by survival. When he traced his history carefully, he found a memory he had stored with such care it had nearly become invisible. At 7 years old, he had been deeply attached to a teacher who had been the stable figure in his life during a period when his family was in crisis. When that teacher transferred to another school, David made a decision, with the flawless logic of a 7-year-old, that the safest path forward was never to get that attached again. That decision was 51 years old, and it was still running. The turning point for David wasn't a cure. It was the moment he sat with that memory and, for the first time, cried. Not performed sadness, recognition. The tears were his nervous system acknowledging that the decision had been made with self-love, by a child who had no other tools available and who now did. This is what Carl Rogers called congruence, the moment when what you feel and what you acknowledge as real come into alignment. Rogers believed the drive toward health is inherent in every human being. What blocks it isn't incapacity. It's the absence of safe enough conditions to look. The second case is a woman we'll call Amanda, 38, who had a clear financial pattern. Every time she accumulated a meaningful emergency fund, an emergency appeared. Medical bills, car repairs, home repairs, always something different. But the result was always the same. Her account returned to zero before crossing a certain number. When Amanda did the investigative work, she found something that surprised her with its simplicity. In the house where she grew up, having money saved was synonymous with family tension. When there was money in savings, her parents fought about how to spend it. Zero balance brought peace. Savings brought conflict. Amanda's body had learned that holding on to money was dangerous, so it reliably generated situations that returned the balance to zero, not through conscious sabotage, but through unconscious protection of the emotional state she associated with the absence of conflict. When she saw this, she didn't need an elaborate protocol. She needed to name it, and in naming it, separate it. The safety I'm looking for is no longer in the house where money caused arguments. It's here, now, and I can build a new association between saved money and peace. The third case is perhaps the most revealing because it's the most common and the least glamorous. James, 44, had a pattern with authority figures. Every boss he had ever worked for had become, in his experience, controlling, unfair, or incompetent, without exception. James wasn't difficult by choice, but there was something in the way he positioned himself with authority figures that invariably created friction. When James examined this without the armor of judgment, he found a father who loved him deeply but expressed that love almost entirely through constant criticism and control. James had learned that authority figure and threat to autonomy were the same thing, and his nervous system automatically updated every person in a position of authority with that equation. Peterson, who has written and spoken extensively on the psychology of hierarchies and authority, would say that relational patterns with authority figures are among the most persistent precisely because they were among the first. The brain creates its deepest maps in primary relationships and uses those maps as the reference point for every hierarchical relationship that follows. The turning point for James wasn't becoming submissive or changing his values around authority. It was realizing he was responding to his father every time he looked at a boss, and that his current boss was not his father, and that he could choose, consciously, which version of himself to bring into that relationship. 3 stories, 3 different loops. But one pattern in common at the turning point, the moment. The person stopped fighting the pattern and started listening to it. Hélio Couto would describe that moment of listening as the first conscious attunement to the frequency that had been crystallized. You cannot reprogram what you cannot see. And to see, in the deep sense of the word, you have to stop running. The irony of the loop is exactly this. The more you avoid it, the more it reinforces. Because the avoidance itself is part of the pattern. You avoid so you don't have to feel what the pattern activates. And by avoiding, you never process the experience the pattern is trying to complete. The loop stays open, and open circuits seek closure. This is the neuroscience of what Jung described in clinical language 100 years before neuroscientists had the equipment to measure it. What keeps repeating in your life doesn't need more judgment. It needs enough presence to be witnessed to completion. We've arrived at the central point of this journey. And before any protocol or practice, something needs to be said that most videos about patterns don't have the honesty to say. You are not going to break your core pattern this week, not because you're incapable, but because deep patterns don't dissolve with a single insight, no matter how powerful. They dissolve through conscious repetition of a new response, in the context that previously triggered the automatic response, over enough time for the new circuit to become stronger than the old one. This isn't pessimism. It's respect for the actual process. And the actual process is far more generous than the version of overnight transformation the personal development industry frequently sells. Dispenza is precise about this. Neuroplasticity is real, but it requires intention plus attention plus repeated practice. All three together. Intention without attention is just a wish. Attention without practice is intellectual understanding. Only the combination of all three builds the new circuit that, over time, replaces the old. So what does the real protocol look like? The first step is what we'll call honest naming. Not the naming you do to seem self-aware in conversations. The naming you do alone, with unflinching honesty, about the central pattern that shows up in your life. One pattern, not 10, the central one. The one that, when you stop and look, runs underneath almost everything that isn't working the way you want it to. To identify the central pattern, Jung recommended observing not the events, but the emotions. What is the emotion that appears with the most consistency across your loops? Not the most intense. The most consistent: abandonment, betrayal, inadequacy, unworthiness. That emotion is the thread connecting the seemingly different episodes. The second step is investigating the origin without blame. When did that emotion first appear with this intensity? In what context? With whom? Most people find the answer in childhood, not because childhood is the only place patterns form, but because it's where the first maps were drawn with the greatest urgency and the smallest repertoire of response. This is not about blaming your parents. It's about understanding the map. The third step is the separation. What was true then that isn't true now? A child who learns that love is dangerous because a caregiver was unpredictable learned something genuinely true for that context. An adult with emotional resources, financial autonomy, and the ability to choose their relationships is in a fundamentally different context. The nervous system doesn't know this automatically. It needs to be informed deliberately and repeatedly. The fourth step is building the new signal, not empty affirmation. Not "I am abundant" repeated mechanically with no corresponding feeling. What Dispenza calls emotional elevation, consciously generating the emotional state that corresponds to the new reality you want to create, before external circumstances justify that state. This is what neuroscience calls anticipatory learning. The brain learns not only from the past, but from the future it anticipates with sufficient physiological conviction. Hélio Couto would describe this as tuning the informational field to the frequency of the desired state before that state manifests in the physical plane. Same principle, different language. And Carl Rogers would close this protocol with the element most frequently overlooked: compassion for the process. Rogers never pressured his clients to change faster. He created the conditions for genuine change to emerge from the inside, at the pace each person's psyche could integrate. Forcing transformation creates resistance. Holding the process creates flow. Now, the exercise. The core exercise: do before sleep. Whenever and as often as you want, find a place where you can sit for 10 to 15 minutes without interruption. Your bed before sleep works perfectly. A corner of your home where you feel safe works too. Close your eyes. Take 3 breaths with real attention. Not performative deep breathing. Just 3 breaths where you actually notice the air coming in and going out. Now bring to mind the central pattern you want to work with, not as an analysis, as an image or sensation, as if you were a viewer watching a movie where the main character is you, and the loop is playing on screen. Watch the character in the loop without judgment, with genuine curiosity. Now ask the character on screen 1 question. What are you still waiting to happen before you feel safe? Let the answer surface. It might be a word, a scene, a silence. Whatever comes is valid. With that answer in mind, speak internally or softly out loud if you prefer to that character. What you were waiting for already happened in the only way it could have happened. You survived, you're here. And from here forward, you don't need to run this program to keep yourself safe. Close with a statement you'll feel in your body before you say it. Don't say it if you don't feel it. When you feel it, say, I choose to respond to the present with who I am today, not with who I had to be to survive the past. This is not ritual. This is direct communication with the nervous system in the language of safety and recognition. Do it whenever you want. Do it as many times as you want. Each time you do, you are practicing the new circuit. This mantra is not for mechanical repetition. It's for the moment you catch the loop activating, when you feel the automatic response coming, when you recognize the familiar pattern beginning to install itself. In that moment, before you act, say, I recognize this pattern. I understand where it came from. I choose to respond with awareness. 3 sentences, 30 seconds. Enough time for the prefrontal cortex to re-engage before the automatic response executes the old script. It won't always work at first. It works more and more over time, because you are practicing a new circuit and neurons that fire together, wire together. Today's episode opened a door, but the door it opens leads to a path that has steps before and after it, built with a kind of precision. You'll only feel by walking the sequence in full. In the next episode, we're going into territory that's the natural extension of what we explored today. Your brain doesn't just repeat the past, it actively prefers the familiar over the free. There is a biological reason why freedom is more frightening than a familiar prison. And understanding that reason is the next level of clarity that will shift your relationship with change itself. If this episode touched something real in you, the channel has a complete journey waiting. Every episode is a layer, and the layers build on each other in a way that changes not just what you know, but what you're able to feel as genuinely possible for your life. Share this episode with someone you recognize in the loop, not as a way of saying you need this, as a way of saying, you're not alone in this, and there's a way through. Leave a comment. What is the pattern you recognize most clearly in your life right now? Reading the comments in this channel, it becomes obvious that you are not alone. And that recognition, that the loop you've been carrying is shared by thousands of thoughtful, well-intentioned people, is itself a step out of the isolation the pattern often builds around itself. The loop does not define who you are. It only defines the map you've been using. And maps can be redrawn. I am the quantum architect. And you didn't end up here by accident.